What if the money you use every day wasn't just a tool for trade, but a weapon with the power to control entire nations? It might sound like something from a thriller movie, but in reality, this is exactly what the United States has done with its currency, the US dollar. Today, we're diving into how the US weaponized the dollar, turning it into a tool that has shaped global politics, trade, and even wars. Now, you might be wondering, how can a currency be a weapon? Well, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see just how the US turned a simple piece of paper into a tool of immense power, and how the world is starting to push back against it. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. The story starts right after World War II. The world was recovering from years of conflict and chaos. Amidst this uncertainty, the US emerged as a global leader, both economically and politically. But the real turning point came in 1944 at a little-known conference called the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was here that the U.S. set the stage for the dollar's rise to dominance. The decisions made at this conference shaped the financial world we live in today. So, how did it all happen? Stick around till the end, and I'll reveal how the dollar went from a simple currency to the weapon of choice in global politics. Let's break it down. In 1944, the world was in ruins after the devastation of World War II. Countries were rebuilding, economies were shattered, and the global financial system was in desperate need of a reset. Amidst this chaos, a historic agreement took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that would forever change the way the world viewed money. The Bretton Woods Agreement laid the foundation for the US dollar to become the dominant global currency. But how exactly did this happen? At the heart of the agreement was the idea that the US dollar would be the anchor of the global financial system. The US had emerged from the war stronger than ever, and its economy was the largest and most stable in the world. The dollar was pegged to gold, which meant that 1 ounce of gold was worth 35. This made the US dollar the most trusted and reliable currency on the planet. The Bretton Woods system created what we now call the dollar standard. This meant that all other currencies were essentially linked to the US dollar, and countries around the world would hold US dollars as their reserve currency. In simpler terms, if you wanted to trade or invest globally, you needed dollars. The US had just made the dollar the world's primary medium of exchange. So, what did this mean for the global economy? For the US, it meant incredible leverage. With the dollar as the world's reserve currency, countries needed to hold large amounts of US dollars to conduct international trade. The US didn't just control its own economy. It had influence over the economies of countries all around the world. By using the dollar as a tool in international trade, the US was able to dictate the rules of global commerce. But this wasn't just about economics. The US had a massive advantage in shaping global politics too. Think about it. When countries needed dollars to trade, the U.S. controlled the supply. This gave the U.S. unprecedented power, not only in trade, but also in foreign relations. If you wanted to stay competitive in the global marketplace, you had to do business in dollars, and that meant aligning with U.S. interests. Fast forward to the 1970s, when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard. No longer tied to gold, the dollar was free to float in value, but its power had already been established. The trust in the U.S. government and its military strength, coupled with the global demand for dollars, solidified its dominance. Now, the dollar was no longer just backed by gold, but by the sheer economic might of the United States. And this wasn't just about trade. The U.S. had found a way to make the dollar a tool of political power. By using the dollar as a weapon in trade agreements and foreign aid, the U.S. had the ability to influence decisions made by foreign governments. If a country wanted to engage with the U.S. economically, they had to adhere to the rules set by the U.S. government. So, what does this mean for the countries around the world? Well, it meant they were forced to play by the U.S.'s rules. For decades, this system worked, countries needed dollars, and the U.S. profited from it. But in the background, there was always an underlying question: how long could this system last? The U.S. dollar's dominance wasn't just a symbol of economic power. It was a strategic tool that the U.S. could use to protect its interests and exert control over global markets. But as we'll see, this powerful weapon came with its own set of challenges, and cracks began to appear in the system. Let's fast forward to the 1970s. The U.S. had already established the dollar as the world's dominant currency, but now it was about to take things a step further by tying the dollar directly to oil. This move would change the entire global trade system and give the U.S. even more control over the world economy. You've probably heard the term petrodollar, but what does it really mean, and how did it cement the U.S. dollar's power on the world stage? In 1971, after abandoning the gold standard, the U.S. made a crucial deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection and political support, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exports in U.S. dollars. This agreement didn't just affect Saudi Arabia. It set off a chain reaction that impacted the entire oil market. Over time, other oil-producing countries followed suit, and oil transactions worldwide were conducted in dollars. Why is this so important? Oil is, without a doubt, one of the most critical commodities in the world. Almost every country needs oil to fuel its industries, power its cars, and keep its economies running. By making oil transactions exclusively in U.S. dollars, the U.S. had just ensured that the dollar would remain in demand across the globe. No longer could countries simply trade oil in their local currencies. They needed U.S. dollars to buy oil. This is where the petrodollar system was born. Now, let's take a moment to think about the impact of this. For decades, every country, from Japan to Brazil, was required to hold U.S. dollars in order to purchase oil. This meant that global reserves of U.S. dollars were constantly in circulation, fueling the demand for the currency. The U.S. didn't just have influence over the global oil market. It had a powerful hand in almost every international transaction because oil was at the core of the global economy. But the U.S. wasn't done yet. This dominance extended beyond oil. Other countries also needed to stockpile dollars for international trade. In order to buy goods from the U.S. or trade with nations that dealt in U.S. dollars, countries had to maintain large reserves of dollars. This resulted in the U.S. holding a unique position in the global economy. Countries relied on the U.S. dollar to settle transactions, which made the dollar the backbone of international trade. The U.S. dollar's dominance in global trade gave the U.S. extraordinary economic leverage. If countries wanted to participate in global commerce, they had to play by the U.S.'s rules. This wasn't just about economic benefit. It was a form of control. The U.S. had a hand in every trade deal, every commodity price, and every international agreement. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a tool of influence. But here's the catch. This power didn't come without challenges. Countries with large economies, like China and Russia, started to question the system. Some countries began looking for ways to trade oil and other goods without using the U.S. dollar. It was a slow burn, but the foundation had been set for a potential shift in the global balance of power. For now, though, the petrodollar system kept the U.S. firmly at the center of global trade. But as we'll explore, cracks in this system were starting to show, and the world was beginning to question just how long the U.S. could maintain this stranglehold on the global economy. The U.S. dollar has always been more than just a currency. It's a tool of immense political power. While most people see the dollar as a means of exchange for goods and services, it's also become a weapon that the U.S. uses to influence other nations, shape global politics, and enforce its will across the world. One of the most powerful ways the U.S. uses the dollar to exert its political influence is through sanctions. Imagine this. A country steps out of line, challenges U.S. interests, or refuses to follow the rules set by Washington. What happens next? The U.S. can simply cut that country off from the global financial system by limiting access to U.S. dollars. Take Iran as an example. For years, the U.S. has used financial sanctions to punish Iran for its nuclear program and its political stance in the Middle East. These sanctions prevent Iran from using the U.S. dollar in trade, freezing Iranian assets held in U.S. banks, and blocking its access to key international financial systems. Without access to the dollar, Iran's economy suffers tremendously as it can no longer engage in many global trade deals, particularly with countries that use the dollar as the primary currency. But the U.S. has taken this a step further. The U.S. also controls access to systems like SWIFT, the global messaging network that facilitates international bank transactions. The moment the U.S. cuts a country off from SWIFT, it makes it nearly impossible for that country to do business internationally. Suddenly, businesses and financial institutions around the world are no longer able to make payments, transfer funds, or secure deals with that nation. Another notable example is Russia. After the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing tensions with Ukraine, the U.S. imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia. This meant freezing Russian assets, blocking financial institutions from using U.S. dollars, and restricting trade. By targeting Russia's access to the dollar, the U.S. put immense pressure on its economy. Russia, facing isolation from the global financial system, has been forced to look for alternatives, but this system of dollar-based sanctions has kept the U.S. in control. But it's not just countries that directly challenge U.S. policy that feel the power of the dollar. Even nations that are neutral or not directly involved in conflicts are hesitant to cross the U.S. because of the repercussions. The threat of being cut off from the dollar-driven global trade system acts as a powerful deterrent. Many countries fear that any economic move that displeases Washington could result in sanctions or being blacklisted from the international financial community. This gives the U.S. significant leverage without having to fire a single shot. This system is extremely effective, but it's not without its risks. More and more countries are starting to push back. China and Russia, for instance, have been building their own financial networks to bypass U.S. control. China has created a yuan-based trading system, and Russia has explored ways to trade using alternative currencies like gold, euros, and even cryptocurrencies. Despite these efforts, the U.S. dollar's role in global politics remains firmly entrenched. The ability to use the dollar as a weapon has allowed the U.S. to maintain a strategic advantage in shaping international relations. It's not just about the economy anymore. It's about maintaining a geopolitical edge. But what happens when other countries begin to challenge this dominance? What if the rest of the world starts moving away from the dollar in favor of alternatives? That's a question that may define the future of global finance and political power. For decades, the U.S. dollar has reigned supreme, dominating the global financial system, with countries around the world using it for trade, investments, and even as their primary reserve currency. But as the world changes, so too does the dollar's position. The cracks in the dollar's dominance are beginning to show, and the future of the dollar as the world's currency is now uncertain. One of the biggest challenges to the dollar's supremacy comes from rising global competition. Countries like China and Russia, along with several others, have started looking for ways to reduce their reliance on the U.S. dollar. They're building their own systems to challenge the dollar's monopoly on international trade. Take China, for example. China has been working hard to internationalize its currency, the yuan, and has taken major steps to make it more appealing for global trade. In 2016, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, added the yuan to its special drawing rights basket, which is a reserve asset that includes other major currencies like the dollar, euro, and yen. This move was a significant step in China's quest to make the yuan a global reserve currency, positioning it as a competitor to the U.S. dollar. But that's not all. China has also been striking bilateral trade agreements with countries across the world, allowing them to trade directly in yuan or their local currencies, bypassing the U.S. dollar entirely. For instance, China and Russia have agreed to trade oil, gas, and other commodities in local currencies instead of U.S. dollars. In 2020, they announced they would settle most of their trade in their own currencies, further reducing their reliance on the dollar. Russia is also leading the charge in exploring alternatives to the dollar. Following the 2014 sanctions, Russia has sought to decrease its dependence on U.S. dollars by investing in gold, strengthening its local currency, and diversifying its reserves into other assets. In recent years, Russia has been working on building up its own financial network to bypass the U.S.-dominated system. The country has even started using cryptocurrencies in some trade agreements as a way to avoid dollar-based systems altogether. This push to de-dollarize the global economy is not just coming from a few isolated countries. The trend is gaining traction worldwide. Many emerging markets and developing countries are also seeking alternatives to the US dollar, as they feel the burden of US economic policies and sanctions. Nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia have started to explore their own options, with some even turning to digital currencies or local currencies for trade. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The US dollar is still the dominant currency in international trade, and the shift away from it is slow and gradual. However, these efforts show that the dollar's grip on global finance is loosening. The rise of the yuan, Russia's de-dollarization efforts, and the exploration of alternatives to the dollar all point to a potential future where the dollar is no longer the undisputed leader. But it's not just the emergence of new competitors that poses a threat to the dollar. The digital revolution is also playing a part. With the rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, countries could soon have their own digital versions of their currencies, making it easier to trade without the need for the US dollar. China has already launched its digital yuan, and other countries, including the European Union and the US, are exploring their own digital currencies. If CBDCs become widely adopted, they could significantly reduce the need for the US dollar in global transactions. So, what does this mean for the future of the US dollar? The dollar's dominance may not disappear overnight, but the foundation it once stood on is becoming more unstable. As countries find ways to bypass the US dollar, the power dynamics of the global economy could shift dramatically. The question remains, how will the US respond to this growing challenge? And what will the global financial landscape look like in the coming decades? The world has been shaped by the dominance of the US dollar for over half a century. From the moment it became the world's reserve currency at Bretton Woods, the dollar has not only fueled international trade, but has been a powerful weapon in the hands of the US government. But as we've seen, this system is slowly unraveling. The rise of alternative currencies, the push for de-dollarization, and the growth of digital currencies are all signals that the days of the US dollar's unchecked dominance may be numbered. Countries are starting to challenge the status quo, seeking ways to break free from the control that the dollar has exerted over global markets. But here's the real question. What would happen if the dollar's dominance were to fade away? If the world no longer needed the US dollar for international trade, what would that mean for the US economy and its political influence? The global financial system would undergo a massive shift, and countries that have relied on the dollar for decades could find themselves on equal footing with the US in ways they've never experienced before. The rise of the yuan, the push for alternative payment systems, and the potential of central bank digital currencies show that the future of global finance is uncertain. And while it may seem like a far-off shift, the momentum is already building. We could be looking at a world where the US no longer holds the same financial sway it once did. So what do you think? Is the US dollar's dominance in danger, or is this just a passing trend? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how this could change the future of global finance. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to keep up with more deep dives into the world's most important financial and political issues. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in the world of global currencies is just getting started.